faced on a daily basis with the most evil and discriminatory images that this world has ever seen. In a time where war and hunger and tragedy are projected to us on the news or reported about in headlines of newspapers, it is hard to have hope. In these times, it can seem like the heroes we were brought up with, the ones that battle the baddies and drive into the sunset the love of their life by their side, belong mostly behind the television screen and between the covers of books. It seems unfair then that we discover that the villains worthy of these films or novels are very much real. For every Malala that inspires, there is a Coney that incites terror. For every smile brought about by the building of a new school, there are tears to find their home destroyed in the hazes of war. But occasionally, heroes will appear, real heroes. They do not fly around in tight underwear worn over their trousers. They do not wear capes or squat on the edge of tall buildings, glaring out at the cityscape. Often, the work they do, important work, is not even noticed. Peter Tatchell is one of these heroes. Just a few of his contributions in activism include animal rights and global warming. His anti-apartheid work in South Africa in the 80s contributed to the African National Congress to, for the first time, renounce homophobia and make it the first public commitment to lesbian and gay human rights. He has campaigned with the Rock Against Racism and the Anti-Nazi League, and he has been defending the rights of the LGBT community for over 40 years. He does not wear tight underwear over his trousers, that we know of. Ladies and gentlemen, a true modern-day hero, Peter Tatchell.
Thank you for that very kind, generous introduction. I was asked to talk today on the issue of campaigning. And I began campaigning 47 years ago at the age of 15. So work it out, 1967. So I've been campaigning for almost half a century. And those campaigns have crossed a broad spectrum of issues around social justice and human rights. I'm probably best known for my work on lesbian, gay, bisexual and transgender human rights. But I also do a lot of work supporting democracy movements in countries like Pakistan, Iran, Uganda and Russia. And the guiding principle of all my work is that human rights are universal and indivisible. That everyone on this planet, whatever their background, wherever they live, is entitled to the same human rights. And that just because we live in a very rich, developed country doesn't mean that we should have more rights than people in other countries. You know, poverty or tyranny or different ethnic or religious cultures is no excuse for the denial of human rights. And of course, this principle is enshrined in the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And it states that everybody on this planet, in every corner of the earth, is entitled to these fundamental rights set out in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Now, of course, in my nearly half a century of activism, I've been involved in many different styles of campaigning. You know, there's no one single model. There are many ways to campaign. Some of you may be familiar with the website writetothem.com. Writetothem.com. If you go to that website, it'll ask you to put in your postcode, and then it will tell you who your Member of Parliament is, who your members of the European Parliament are, who your members of the London Assembly are, and who your local councillors are. And from that website, you can email them direct. So if there's any issue you're concerned about, you can contact your elected representatives and question them. You can ask them to raise issues on your behalf. So that's one style of activism. Another style of activism is, of course, being involved in an organisation, like Outrage, the LGBT campaign group, or my own Peter Tatchell Foundation, or maybe by signing up and getting involved in these organisations, you can take a more proactive role in making change happen. And those organisations, again, will work in a variety of ways. Sometimes it will be signing a petition. Sometimes it might be writing a letter to an ambassador from a country where there are human rights abuses. On other occasions, it may be to write a letter to a political prisoner to give that person hope and morale support. Another occasion, it may be going on a protest. Another occasion, it might be boycotting certain products in protest at the actions of a big company. So there are many different styles of activism, many different models. I've tended to follow the model of the Chartists, the suffragettes, and the Black Civil Rights Movement in the United States. Those movements used direct action. They went and challenged people in power to make their claim for social justice. So I'm sure you're familiar with the suffragists and the suffragettes. The suffragists were very mainstream lobbyists. They wrote letters to members of parliament, they had meetings with government ministers, they wrote letters to the papers. They did things in the traditional way that British people have done them. But the suffragettes were much more uppity. They saw that the suffragist model wasn't working, that merely asking for women's right to vote was not getting the result. So the suffragettes went on hunger strike. They did lots of things I personally wouldn't approve of, like attacking government ministers in the street, putting bombs in letterboxes, burning down churches. Suffragettes burned down churches because the churches in this country said women should not have the vote, that women were inferior to men, and it was God's plan that only men should vote. So in retaliation, the suffragettes went and burned down churches. So those were quite extreme methods. You've probably all heard of Emily Davidson, who threw herself under the King's horse in protest to deny the votes to women and tragically died. You've probably also heard of the many suffragettes who were jailed and went on hunger strike and were forcibly fed. Those methods were quite extreme, but many people would argue that it was thanks to the suffragettes that the issue of women's right to vote got on the mainstream political agenda and pressured the government to change. I'm not saying the suffragettes alone brought the change about, but I think that their efforts really raised the public profile of the campaign for women's votes. It conscientised lots of the public. It put politicians under increasing pressure. In my own work, sometimes I write letters to government ministers. Sometimes I draft legislation or aspects of legislation. Sometimes I lobby ambassadors and governments overseas. But also, of course, sometimes I adopt the methods of the suffragettes. And a good example was that until 1990, in London, until 1990, same-sex couples who merely kissed or cuddled in a public place could be arrested, prosecuted, and fined. So, for example, there's a famous case of two lesbians. They were at a bus stop in central London. They'd been out for a night together. They had to go back to their respective homes. They gave each other a goodnight kiss, just like any boy and girl might normally do. They were arrested, amazingly, under the Public Order Act. Under the Public Order Act, they were accused of behaviour likely to cause harassment, alarm, or distress to members of the public. And they were convicted and fined, I think it was £60. So anyway, this has been happening quite a lot. So we tried negotiating with the police. We said to the police, look, this is not what the Public Order Act was set up to do. The Public Order Act was set up to stop football hooliganism and to stop violent disorder and riots in the streets. It wasn't meant to prosecute same-sex couples who are just giving each other a goodnight kiss and cuddle. Anyway, those negotiations, those representations to the police came to nothing. The police were impervious. they just, said yes, well, we'll consider what you're saying. And they went away and then arrested some more people. So we decided to hold a kiss-in, a mass kiss-in in Piccadilly Circus to challenge the police. We announced about 2 weeks in advance we're going to hold a mass kiss-in of same-sex couples in Piccadilly Circus, and if the police thought this law was worth defending, they should come and arrest us all. If they didn't, they should make an announcement that henceforth the law would not be used to arrest and prosecute same-sex couples. So it was a very big, high-profile challenge. We did this about 2 weeks in advance, and it got masses and masses of coverage in the newspapers, on TV and radio. So it was a challenge to the police: either arrest us or abandon the use of this law. And of course, lots of people who perhaps didn't entirely support gay rights, they thought, well, really, when there are so many serious crimes going on, why are the police devoting resources to arresting same-sex couples who harm no one? The police at that time were claiming, oh, we haven't got enough officers to deal with racist attacks. There's not enough officers to deal with domestic violence and rape and other sexual assaults on women. We haven't got enough officers to deal with street burglaries and house robberies. But they had enough officers to go and arrest same-sex couples. So most members of the public, when they heard the story, thought this was a really stupid, wasteful use of police time and resources. So we began to win hearts and minds even before the kiss-in took place. And then, of course, on the night of the kiss-in, we had nearly, I think about 200, maybe even 300 same-sex couples turned up. The whole of Piccadilly Circus was full. And the plan was at 6 o'clock, we'd make the announcement, there'd be a big mass kiss-in, and we'd challenge the police to arrest us. Lo and behold, about an hour before the kiss-in was due to start, I got a message from the then Metropolitan Police Commissioner, Sir Paul Condon, that same-sex couples would not be arrested for merely kissing and cuddling in the street. And that the Metropolitan Police had changed their policy, they had issued instructions that would never happen again. So even before the protest, we won. We had forced the police to back down. The negotiations hadn't worked. We tried meeting with the police, as I said. They were very nice and polite, but just carried on doing these arrests. But when we did that direct action, it changed police policy and saved many same-sex couples from arrest and conviction. The funny afterside is that about a week or so afterwards, we received a call at the outrage office from a Japanese tour company. They said, oh, we're just phoning up to find out when you're doing the next kiss-in. They explained that they had been just by accident, by chance, passing through Piccadilly Circus that night and come across the protest. The people in the tour party had enjoyed it so much that they wanted to know when the next one was. So if you can do a protest that's fun, imaginative, a good time, of course, that obviously makes it more, makes the public more receptive, more receptive and more open. There are, of course, lots of issues which can be quite controversial, even more controversial than that. For example, in the 1990s, the then newly appointed Archbishop of Canterbury, Dr. George Carey, was on record as not merely saying that homosexuality was wrong and immoral, but he also said that gay people are not entitled to equal rights. And he argued that the government and MPs and members of the House of Lords should vote against gay equality. So he said gay people should not have protection against discrimination in employment. That it should be okay in certain circumstances for employers to fire someone because they're lesbian, gay, bisexual or transgender. He said that same-sex couples should not be allowed to foster and adopt children. He said that the age of consent should not be equalised, because in those days, in the early part of the 1990s, the age of consent for boys and girls was 16, but for two men it was 21. And a young man aged 16 to 20 who had sex with his boyfriend could be jailed for up to 2 years. So the Archbishop was very strongly in support of discriminatory laws. We asked to meet him. He refused. For 8 years, he refused to even meet us. He wouldn't even meet members of the lesbian and gay Christian movement. These are LGBT people who are Christians, many of whom were part of the Church of England, Dr. Carey's church. He wouldn't meet anyone to discuss these issues. So we decided in 1998 to challenge him face to face. We decided to do that on Easter Sunday in his cathedral at Canterbury, knowing that all the world's media would be there to televise the event, because we wanted to shame him in front of his own congregation and in front of the wider Church of England and in front of the wider public. So we went to Canterbury Cathedral that morning. We were dressed in our Sunday best, very respectable. We sat in the side aisles, reading our Bibles and whatever, and waited until the sacred parts of the service were over. So we didn't interrupt prayers or anything like that. We waited until he began his sermon, the political part of his Easter Sunday service. And then we just calmly walked up to the pulpit. Now, on the way going to the pulpit, we noticed there were 3 church wardens standing right by the pulpit, sort of guarding him. So one of our members, there were 6 of us, one of our members had the imagination. He feigned an asthma attack. He started going, and of course the goodly wardens rushed over to help him. And so we just walked up straight into the pulpit, and there I stood right next to the Archbishop of Canterbury. In fact, he moved out of the way to give me the space. And then I didn't insult him or the Christian religion. I simply said that he supported discrimination, and discrimination was not a Christian value. And that, unfortunately for us, being a very major civic occasion, as well as the congregation, in the front row were all the civic dignitaries, the mayor, leading councillors, the fire chief, the ambulance chief, the police chief, and some of his officers. So all they had to do was jump out of the pews and come around to the pulpit and one by one drag us out. I didn't actually see them coming, and I was holding on to the front of the pulpit like this, and suddenly these arms went around my waist, I got yanked. And because I was holding on to the pulpit, part of this ancient pulpit came away in my hand. So anyway, I was arrested, and they didn't know what to charge me with. They were going to charge me with criminal damage. I didn't pull the pulpit off, they pulled the pulpit off. Anyway, we went back, we were bailed to, I was bailed, no one else was actually arrested that day. The others were released without charge. So I was about to return, and when I returned, I was told I'm going to be charged under the 1860 Ecclesiastical Courts Jurisdiction Act, formerly part of the Brawling Act of 1551. And under that act, any kind of disruption of a minister of religion is a criminal offence. So no matter how brief or peaceful, it's a crime. So it came to the court case. The judge heard all the evidence. He accepted it was a brief, peaceful protest. He accepted I hadn't been abusive or insulting or used any bad language, that I'd been very polite and courteous. But he said, this law exists. It says that if you make any disruption of church minister's service, you are committing an offence. So he could have fined me £5,000 and sent me to prison for 6 months. But instead he gave me the fine of £18.60. His comical reference to the 1860 Act under which I'd been convicted. And in fact, I think I'm one of only a handful of people who have ever been convicted under that law, ever. And it is extraordinary because it's the most blanket law governing any public figure or institution. There's no such law about disrupting Downing Street or disrupting Parliament. The churches have this particular unique privileged law. The final point I'd make is that when you look at the history of this country, we can see that virtually every right and freedom we have has been won as a result of protest. I'm sure many of you may have picked up a newspaper this morning, read a newspaper. You know, until the 1700s, all newspapers in this country were censored. They were subject to the state censor. They were subject to onerous taxes to try and make them unaffordable to ordinary people, so that ordinary people couldn't get the news. So there were long, hard battles won only after newspaper editors went to prison for defying these restrictions on a free press. Yeah. Lots of people were charged with sedition for challenging the authority of government and parliament, for criticising the monarch, and things like that. So these are all freedoms which have been hard won. Likewise, freedom of speech. You know, under the sedition laws that once existed, you know, the ability of an ordinary person to criticise a government or the king or queen was severely restricted. People went to prison to defend and assert and win the right of free speech. So of course, eventually the sedition laws were repealed. I mentioned the suffragettes, a really good example of how, you know, the struggle and battle of very many brave, courageous women won all women the right to vote. I think about, in recent times, the battles for lesbian, gay, bisexual and transgender human rights. You know, just think about the change in the last decade or so. Until 1999, Britain had, by volume, the largest number of anti-gay laws of any country in the world. And some of these laws dated back centuries. Have you all heard of Oscar Wilde? Great playwright. He was jailed in 1895 for 2 years, hard labour, for a consenting sexual relationship with another man, or other men. That law had been passed in 1885. It was only repealed in 2003. Likewise, the crime of anal sex, whether between men or between women, whether between men or between men and women, the crime of anal sex was originally passed in 1533 during the reign of King Henry VIII. It was only repealed in 2003. So the abolition of all the many different anti-gay laws has happened really in just over the last decade or so. So for example, in the last decade, same-sex couples have been allowed to foster and adopt children. There have been laws introduced to prohibit discrimination on the grounds of sexual orientation and gender identity in the workplace, and also in the provision of goods and services. There's been the equalisation of the age of consent, so it's now 16 for everyone, gay, straight and bisexual. The ban on lesbian and gay people serving in the armed forces was repealed. And also, of course, we had civil partnerships for same-sex couples in 2005, and then same-sex marriage last year, which will come into force later this month. So it's been a phenomenal pace of law reform. And a lot of it has been due to behind-the-scenes lobbying of MPs and things like that. But a lot of it has also been as a result of direct action protests, like the kissing I mentioned. So for example, when there was still a ban on lesbian and gay people serving in the armed forces, I was involved in organising many big high-profile protests to draw attention to the hypocrisy. The fact that many of Britain's most famous military heroes are allegedly gay or bisexual. People like Field Marshals Haig and Kitchener, Admiral Batten, and Field Marshal Montgomery. Considerable evidence that they were gay or bisexual. So the argument was, well, if we revere these men, rightly or wrongly, as military heroes, you know, they were able to root it out. We would have not had the value of their contribution to Britain's military experience. Now, of course, we can debate whether they were good guys or bad guys, and I think some of the things they did were very wrong. but I certainly think Field Marshal Montgomery, in fighting Nazism, he was a good guy. You know, he helped defeat Hitler in battles in North Africa and in Europe. But some of the others, like Field Marshal Kitchener and maybe Hay, I think their role in the First World War was probably much more contestable and dubious. But anyway, it was through those protests that we raised public awareness about the ban on gay people in the armed forces and the fact that the military had a two-faced policy. It revered these people on the one hand, but sought to ban other gay people on the other. At the end of the day, my motto is very simple. Don't accept the world as it is. Dream of what the world could be, and then help make it happen. Thank you.
So, has anybody got any questions they would like to ask?
Have you like ever maybe done something that you later on regretted that you thought you could have done differently in getting human rights? Like maybe a protest or the way you went about something, maybe in the beginning.
Yeah. I think looking back, there's lots of things I would have done better. And in fact, every time I've done a protest, I always think, I should have done this or I should have done that. And I think it's quite important to have a self-critical attitude, because that's the way you improve and get better. If you just have an arrogant attitude, oh, I did that, that's perfect, then you never learn. So after every protest, I always think, well, should have done this, should have done that. So just to give you, a couple of examples. When Tony Blair led this country to war against Iraq, I tried to organise a number of protests to challenge him face to face. And in fact, eventually, I did manage to, one day in 2003, just before the Iraq War started, I ambushed his motorcade in central London. I found out where he was going. He was going to a meeting at the Royal Academy in Piccadilly to meet the German Chancellor, Gerhard Schroeder. And I knew he was coming from Downing Street, so I worked out there were only two routes he could come to get there. And so I just guessed that he'd come via the Green Park end of Piccadilly to go with the traffic flow rather than against the traffic, because it was a one-way system. So I lay in wait outside not exactly outside the Royal Academy, because that was under complete police lockdown. This is a time when there were still threats of terrorism. Of course there's still threats of terrorism now, but that was quite much more heightened in those days. I lay in wait further up the street. I relied upon 2 journalists and 2 video crews. You should never do that. You should always have about 6. And anyway, I hid in a shop called Gifts of London. And I stood in the shop, back away from the window, so any police officers walking past couldn't see me. But so I had an eye line up the street, up Piccadilly towards Green Park, so I could see the oncoming traffic. So the idea was to be able to see the Prime Minister's limousine and the motorcycle outriders arriving, and then I would go out the door and run across the street. Anyway, one of my findings is I didn't have enough journalists and TV crews, because basically they missed it. They got the last little bit of it, because they weren't really on point, and I told them where I was going to be and everything, but I hadn't given them enough precise instructions, and they weren't just watching, they were chatting among themselves. Anyway, so I saw the motorcycle outriders come, the blue flashing lights, and I thought, well, who's in this first car? Is it Gerhard Schroeder or is it Tony Blair? I sort of thought, let's just hope Gerhard Schroeder is in the Royal Academy already, and this is Tony Blair. So I just walked out the shop, straight across the road, and then just as I was getting halfway across the road, the motorcycle outriders went. Then I let the first car go past, on the guess that it was probably special branch or security detail, and they just ran straight in front of the second car, which happened to be Tony Blair's car. And it screeched to a halt about 6 inches from my legs. Then I had a placard up the back of my jacket and pulled out a placard against the Iraq War. I could have had, a Kalashnikov or something, but I had a placard. Now, I remember Blair in the back seat of the car. He's up, how he rolls his eyes, that sort of look. Anyway, it's amazing. It seemed I was there for quite a long time. It was probably only about a minute because the car that had gone ahead hadn't noticed what had happened. They just kept on driving into the Royal Academy. The car behind was another one with security detail, but they couldn't see. They couldn't see what happened. They didn't actually see me apparently walk in front of the car. They just saw Blair's car stop, but didn't know why. So they just stopped behind it. So for about 30 seconds I was there, holding my placard, before eventually the guys in the security car behind got out and then tried to manhandle me out of the way. But I wasn't going lightly, so I held on under the chassis of the car, at the front of the car, as they tried to drag me away. And I don't know how I had the strength. These were two really big, burly, special branch or whatever they were. They couldn't remove it. In the end, they gave me a really hard yank together and they pulled me off the front. But my fingertips clipped the number plate accidentally, and the number plate, the 3 of the screws came out, so the number plate just hung there swinging. Anyway, I was carted off and held in Vine Street Police Station, I think, for about 5 or 6 hours. And eventually I was released without charge, and no charges were preferred. But I like to think the fact that the rest of the day the Prime Minister drove around in a car with a swinging hanging number plate. That wasn't really necessarily a good story, but example of things I've done wrong. We outed 10 Anglican bishops in 1994, not because they were gay, but because they were hypocrites and homophobes. They were gay, but they were supporting a church that was anti-gay. Now, we did that to target their hypocrisy and their homophobia. But I don't think we did the PR and the press well enough, because a lot of press thought we did it just because they were gay. We didn't say it wasn't for that reason, but we didn't say it strongly enough, and we didn't have backup. Everybody involved in the protest went to the protest, and we should have actually left someone in the office to man the phones and to correct the misinterpretation of what we were doing. But that was a very effective one, because as a result of that outing, as far as I know, none of those bishops ever again said anything anti-gay in public. And in fact, 2 of them ended up becoming quite strong supporters of gay equality. So yeah, there's always the possibility and the opportunity to do things better.
When it comes to creating public awareness in protests, without going through a large organisation with contacting the press and maybe a big reputation, how would you recommend to sort of get a message out to the public?
Well, of course, one of the most effective ways to do a protest is to do a protest at an event where the press are already there. So, for example, when we did the Easter Sunday protest in Canterbury Cathedral, we did take a journalist and a video crew and a photographer. But we also knew that because it was a big public occasion, a very important occasion in the church calendar, there'd be lots of media there and the event would be televised. So by doing the protest there, we were guaranteed media coverage. The same with, if you do a protest at a football match or an event attended by the Queen or the Prime Minister, you're almost 90% certain that there will be media coverage, because the media go wherever those people go. They go to big sporting events, So it's quite possible for, lone individuals to make an impact. You remember the guy, I think it was Trenton Oldfield, who disrupted the Oxford-Cambridge boat race. He didn't have any media plan. He just knew the media would be covering the event, whether you agree or disagree with what he did, it was effective because it got a lot of media coverage. So having those contacts is not essential, providing you're doing a protest at an event where you know there's going to be media.
Are there any, is there anything that you've seen other people do and you thought, gosh, I wish I'd done that, I wish I'd thought of that you kind of sort of feel, I don't know, activist jealousy?
I'm not a jealous person, but yeah, I think that the protests organised by Greenpeace are very effective. You know, when they do a little rubber dinghy in front of a gigantic nuclear-powered submarine, that's really powerful. You know, the small guy against the big, powerful Armageddon. You know, I don't entirely agree with Fathers for Justice, but I think a lot of their protests were very effective and, you know, put their issues about fathers' right to access to their kids in the news. Trying to think what other ones stick in my mind. You know, when back in the days in the 1980s, when the government had a law called Section 28, which prohibited the promotion, so-called, of homosexuality by local authorities, in protest at the law, a handful of lesbians invaded the BBC 6 o'clock news and disrupted it live on air. They got into the actual studio. That was very effective. That was a really good example of an effective protest, because obviously, you know, millions of people watching that program. What's all this about? You know, and of course it was headlines in the papers the next day.
How did you first get into this?
How did I first get involved? Well, the first thing I can remember was about the white racist bombing of a black church in Birmingham, Alabama, in the United States, where 4 young girls about my own age were murdered in this bomb attack. And I can remember thinking to myself, how could anyone kill another human being, let alone 4 young girls in a church on Sunday morning? How could anybody do that? And of course, I followed the responses and, you know, heard the statements of Martin Luther King and the other black civil rights movement leaders. And so that engaged me in the black civil rights movement and their struggle for justice in America. And I've obviously adapted a lot of their methods. You know, the black civil rights movement was about direct action. You know, it wasn't about just writing letters to Congress or the president. It was about people taking action. So the black civil rights movement, they went and sat in at lunch counters. You know, where there were lunch counters, like at Woolworths and other big stores that refused to serve black people, they went there and demanded to be served and were arrested. You know, in the 1970s, I had a relationship with an African American guy whose mother had led a protest at a segregated beach. You know, they lived in the deep south in Georgia, and at the main local beach, it was for white people only. And black people had to go way up the coast to a black-only beach. And this guy's mother was involved in the black civil rights movement. She led the protests to force the desegregation of the beach. And they all sat down on the beach, they went into the water and were arrested. Not once or twice, but many times, before eventually desegregation happened. So, you know...
Sorry, did you go to that then?
No, I didn't go, no.
I just wanted to know if you got arrested with them.
No. So that was the first thing that really got my mind thinking. And the second thing was when I was 15, which is really when I began, when I first did a campaign. I was born in Melbourne, Australia. In 1967, the state of Victoria still had the death penalty. And there was an instance where a prisoner who'd escaped from prison allegedly shot dead a prison warder. I read a small summary of the autopsy report which mentioned the trajectory of the bullet through the warder's body. And I worked out at the age of 15 that where the prisoner was supposedly standing and where the warder supposedly was, he could not have fired that bullet. He couldn't have fired the bullet. It was impossible. The bullet would have had to go like that and do a U-turn. Plus there was contradictory evidence from some of the other prison warders and bystanders and members of the public. But he was going to be hanged anyway, despite this evidence. So I got involved in the campaign. I went around my local neighbourhood, chalking slogans on walls and things like that. So that was my first ever protest. That man was hanged anyway. And that destroyed my trust and confidence in the police, the judiciary, and the government. It made me a lifelong skeptic of authority. I thought, if they can hang a man where there is reasonable doubt that he committed the crime, where there's not absolutely conclusive evidence that he was guilty, if they can do that, then these people are not worthy of respect. You can't trust them. You mustn't trust them. And it led me to question other things, like the way in which the black Aboriginal people of Australia were treated. Australia's involvement in the Vietnam War alongside the United States. So I began to question everything. So that's how it all began. But I never intended to do full-time human rights campaigning. In fact, I've only done full-time human rights campaigning since 1983. In 1983, I stood in this local area as a Labour candidate in a by-election. And I was, well, the general consensus is that it was the most sustained media vilification of any public figure in the 20th century, and the most violent election campaign in Britain in the 20th century. I was demonised because I was originally from Australia, so it was quite a racist element to it. I was demonised because I was gay. I was demonised because I was left-wing. And, I was physically attacked 150 times when out canvassing in the street. 150 times. There were 2 attempts to run me down in cars. I had an arson attempt on my flat. I had a bullet through the front door. I had about 30 bricks through my windows. It was like living through a civil war. And, lots of the issues I was espousing, were just very obvious ones about social justice. Defending working class people, demanding a fair share for ordinary folks. So it was quite a tough time. Quite a tough time.
Peter, that's like kind of encapsulates exactly what I want to ask you. You are always putting yourself into tremendous physical danger, and you must need a lot of physical courage to actually do what you do. And I'm just wondering, before you jumped in front of Tony Blair's car, do you ever sort of have a doubt that you're actually going to might get squashed?
Yes.
And how do you actually, when you go through that, are you ever filled with kind of anxiety? I imagine your zeal to do what's right overrides that, but are there ever doubts or feelings of, real feelings of fear doing what you do all the time?
I've done over 3,000 direct action protests. Over 3,000, where I've either broken the law or done something like run in front of somebody's limousine. And every single time, even to this day, my stomach is churning over. I've got a splitting headache. I'm shaking. My body temperature plummets. I feel physically, violently ill. But my will drives me on because I'm thinking of the cause. So some of you may know that I also ambushed President Robert Mugabe of Zimbabwe in 1999 in the street in Victoria. The same kind of tactic, running out in front of his limousine. And yes, there's always a fear the car won't stop or the brakes will fail. On the other hand, you think, well, a prime minister or a president, they probably have their car checked well, and they're probably quite a good driver. They'll slam on the brakes. They won't want to kill a protest. That would be really bad PR. But I am scared, yeah. And there is always that doubt. When I tried to arrest President Mugabe in Brussels in 2001, I was beaten unconscious by his bodyguards by the lobby of the Hilton Hotel. And I knew, or I feared, they may attack me, but I didn't think they'd actually beat me unconscious. Because they did it in front of all the world's media. This was in 2001, in broad daylight, in front of the Belgian police and security services, and in front of TV crews and journalists from all over the world. I was beaten unconscious by President Mugabe's bodyguard. They have no shame. But, paradoxically, it was sort of the best thing that could have happened, because a lot of people said, if President Mugabe is prepared to have his bodyguards beat unconscious a peaceful protester in the centre of a European capital city in broad daylight, in front of the Belgian police and secret service, with all the media present, just imagine what he's doing to his own people when no one's watching. So it was a really graphic example of, the brutality of that regime. I got off lightly. Of course, many Zimbabweans were murdered and killed by his stuff. But I was really proud to do that, to do something to highlight what was happening in Zimbabwe, because in those days, in 1999, 2001, there was very little publicity about the human rights abuses in Zimbabwe, about the mass use of torture, detention without trial, the mass rape of male and female political prisoners by ZANU-PF, Mugabe's thugs. But we helped shine a light on that, and I think also, judging from the emails I received from people in Zimbabwe, it gave them hope, because all the messages I sort of received from people in Zimbabwe said similar things. We thought no one knew. We thought no one cared. You've woken people up. You've made people aware of what's happening. We're really grateful. It's given us a great morale boost. So those kind of things, they are important and do make an impact. Sometimes they're just symbolic, but gestures are important. The man, I don't know if you all know the history of Tiananmen Square massacre in China, where the tanks rolled in to crush the democracy protests organised by students. There's a very, very famous footage of a man standing in front of a tank to stop the tanks rolling in. An incredible act of courage. A symbolic gesture. The tank eventually got through, but the symbolism of that man standing against the military power of the Chinese state, that's really important and significant. And for lots of Chinese people, that man still remains a hero, a totemic symbol of their struggle for freedom and democracy.
In the Iraqi war, even though there was quite a lot of protests, and I was there as well with my family when I was quite small, what do you think they could have did better to improve those, like to get the attention? Because I feel like they didn't listen properly, taking down all of that.
You're right. I mean, one of the problems is that we don't have a fair electoral system. The electoral system is rigged in favour of the three main parties. So it's first past the post. So in a constituency, the person who wins can get 51% of the vote, the person who loses can get 49% of the vote, the person who wins gets the seat. And you have all across Britain examples of parties, smaller parties, that consistently get respectable turnouts and respectable shares of the vote, but don't get any MPs. So for example, the Green Party, which I belong to, in London is often sometimes got 10, 12% of the vote. In London, because we have a proportional system, there are 2 Green members of the London Assembly. But across the country, because of the rigged system, people who want to vote Green think it's a waste of time because they won't stand a chance. But even so, the Greens may get 3 or 4%, but no MPs. So the problem about the Iraq War, if we'd had a fair electoral system, there probably would not have been British intervention in Iraq. There may still have been, but there may not have been. Because if we had a fair, more representative parliament, then alternative voices would have been in that parliament. The Respect Party, the left-wing party would have been there, the Greens would have been there. But having said that, in terms of the protests, you're right. Millions of people protested, and still the government went ahead. And I think it shows that sometimes a protest is not sufficient. You need some kind of leverage. So previously, in the late 80s, early 90s, the Conservative government of Margaret Thatcher introduced a poll tax, which is a form of like council tax. But there weren't bands, there was just one tax for everyone. So a millionaire paid the same poll tax as a poor person. And obviously, means people thought that was very unfair, very wrong, that people with huge wealth would just pay the same as a poor person with hardly any wealth. So hundreds of thousands of people marched in the streets, and of course in one instance, I think in 1990, there were huge riots in central London, and buildings around Trafalgar Square were set on fire. Now I don't agree with violent protests, but it did actually force and shake up the government. It showed that a lot of people, even perhaps a minority, but nevertheless a lot of people felt really, really angry. But the big thing that sunk the poll tax was millions of people either refused to pay or delayed their payment. So it made the system unworkable. The government wasn't getting the money, or wasn't getting it on time, and so the system wasn't working. So ultimately, even though Margaret Thatcher said the poll tax was not negotiable, ultimately, eventually, she did climb down and the poll tax was rescinded. So that's a good example of how using financial leverage can actually help change even a very intransigent, dogmatic government. So I think you need leverage. The lesson is you need leverage of some sort. Now what the leverage could have been against the Iraq War, I'm not sure. Maybe refusing to pay tax or withholding their tax payment. That of course would have incurred fines. Maybe more spirited protests. Besieging individual members of Parliament who were voting and supporting the war. It's hard to know. I think at the end of the day, if you do have a government that's totally intransigent and totally, absolutely determined to go ahead, if you haven't got the numbers in Parliament, then you probably will lose. And that really is a failing of the democratic system, because quite clearly, most people in this country did not support the Iraq War. So the government is going ahead against the majority wishes, and that's not what governments are supposed to do.
There was an act on the news a few days ago that they're going to either put like a law or regulation that they can close local hospitals within 40 days of notice. What are your views on that, and would you maybe protest against that? Or if you did, how would you act it out? And what is the leverage with?
Okay. Well, as I'm sure you already know, quite a lot of hospitals have been closed down, and in particular accident and emergency units. So there are parts of the country where people who are in dire need of medical help have to go a long way to get to an accident and emergency unit. And that is jeopardising people's lives. I think what we're witnessing with the National Health Service is death by 1,000 cuts. Slowly, gradually, bit by bit, the basic fundamental principles of the National Health Service are being eroded. More and more services are being put out to private tender. We've got so many consultants at the top that are taking up money and resources that should be invested in frontline doctors and nurses. So the system, the approach is fundamentally wrong. And Labour is as much to blame as the Conservatives, because it was Labour who introduced a lot of these market mechanisms. Now in terms of how we stop it, well, one way is electorally. One way is by exposing MPs who support these reforms, these changes, and making sure people, local voters, know, and encourage them not to re-elect that person. And as I'm sure you're aware, in at least one constituency, a person who stood to defend the National Health Service was elected. They ousted an existing Member of Parliament. So perhaps standing a candidate to defend the National Health Service might be another way to do it, although, as I said previously, it's very difficult when you've got this electoral system that we have. When it's not proportional, when it's rigged in favour of the big main parties, then it's very hard for an independent candidate or a minor party candidate to win. I think probably the most important thing to do is just to make people aware. So doing direct action protests that highlight the changes and expose the changes and challenge the people making the changes, that's really important. And you have to be prepared to do it not once or twice, but many times. The outrage protests against anti-gay laws, they went on for like 10 more years. And we did protest every fortnight or every month for 10 years. And that's slowly, gradually how we raised awareness and put the government on the spot. I think the same with the National Health Service. That's the way we need to go. Lots of direct action protests, using the outrage style of protest, or Greenpeace, or Fathers for Justice. Those kind of tactics are needed to put the issue in the news, to put people in government under pressure.
When you do a protest at a high-profile event, it's always going to make a good news story. But often, what happens with reporting is facts get distorted to make a juicy story or to fit in with a particular stance. So when you, like you mentioned earlier, you said you take along your own journalists or journalists that you have contact with. Do you ever brief them about spin, and how much do you think that's important?
Yeah, you're right that one of the issues is not only to do the protest, but to get it accurately reported. And there's been many, many examples. I gave the example of Alty, but there's been many other examples where protests we've done have not been, perhaps not entirely misrepresented, but a substantial element of misrepresentation. There's no guarantee against that. All you can do is produce good briefings and send them to the press in advance or immediately after the protest and hope they will read it and they'll look at the evidence. But even though we take our own journalists, these are freelance journalists or freelance photographers, they don't write the stories of the Daily Mail or the Sun or whatever. So it's a chancy thing, but I would say that on balance, most of the time, the message we sought to project was the message reported. Obviously not as well as we'd like it, or the way we'd write it, but broadly speaking, the protests, were reported well. I mean, the Kissing is a really good example. A really, really positive reportage by the Evening Standard and other The Guardian, and Daily Telegraph and Times. It was really well, accurately reported. So, no guarantees, but do good briefings.
Oh, I was going to ask if you've got any more future plans for the LGBT community. Are you going to help them develop the awareness and get equality and that side of things?
Well, of course, with the legislation of same-sex civil marriage, that ends the last major discrimination in law. But as the black community and women know, you can have formal legal equality, that doesn't stop racism or misogyny. So you need to change the law, but that's just the beginning. You also need to change hearts and minds. You also need to change the way institutions operate. Just think of all the revelations this week about the Stephen Lawrence inquiry and the police investigation. How shocking it is that in this day and age, we're still talking about police malpractice, corruption and cover-ups. This case has been going on for 20 years, and still we don't know the full truth. Still there are police officers, apparently quite, who are involved in the case, and some presumably at quite a high level, who have been involved in covering up or failing to properly investigate what really happened. So, in terms of LGBT rights, we've got formal legal equality. We now have to deal with issues like homophobic bullying in schools, or homophobic and transphobic bullying in schools. We know that half of all young LGBT kids say they were subjected to bullying at school. And half of all schools have no anti-bullying program that specifically addresses homophobia or transphobia. And it's particularly bad in faith schools. Faith schools are the worst. There's anecdotal evidence that there are very serious levels of homophobic bullying in faith schools, and faith schools are the ones that do the least to tackle it. So there's a big issue there, a big issue. Sorry?
I was just asking what faith schools were.
Oh yeah. Religious run schools like Church of England schools or Jewish schools or Muslim schools and so on. There are also issues like about the appalling mistreatment of LGBT asylum seekers. That's LGBT people who flee persecution in countries like Russia, Uganda, Jamaica, Nigeria, Saudi Arabia, Iran. They come here for a place of refuge, and they'll often be put in an asylum detention centre, and then be routinely disbelieved. You know, if a gay man is very macho and masculine, he'll be disbelieved because he doesn't look like a gay man. If a lesbian is very pretty and feminine and petite, she'll be disbelieved. She doesn't look like what a lesbian's supposed to look like. You know, stereotyping, exactly, yeah. And you know, they'll say in court, you know, to maybe a gay or lesbian person from Iran, do you read GT magazine, which is a gay magazine? The person can't even read English. Why would they? How can they possibly read GT magazine? And because they're destitute, how can they possibly afford to buy it? But they get away with it. They get away with it. And sometimes, even though they produce evidence that they're gay and lesbian, like love letters or statements from partners or former partners or even family members and friends, they'll still be disbelieved. They'll be told you're making it up. So what's happening nowadays is some lesbian and gay asylum seekers are being forced to film and photograph themselves having sex to prove that they're gay. Isn't that disgusting? That's the Home Office, our government, forces LGBT asylum seekers to do. And many of them come from cultures and faiths, religious beliefs, where displaying any nakedness, let alone sex, is deeply, deeply shameful and offensive. Yet there being of a gay man, I think he's from Uganda. He produced a video of him being penetrated by his partner, and the judge turned around and said, "You haven't got an erection, therefore I don't believe you're gay." I mean, this is just like, this is a British government in 2014. Well, that incident actually happened last year, so 2013. So we have a way to go, Any other questions or contributions or?
Peter, can you stand for Parliament again?
Will I stand for Parliament again?
And if you did, do you imagine you would experience the same kind of vitriol which you experienced the first time? Which I have to say is very, I can't believe that you just said that. Attacked 150 times, that's just appalling.
Yeah. You know, almost all, not just from that thing, but from other protests, you can see my teeth. They're all actually reconstructed. I've been beaten up so many times that virtually all the teeth in my mouth are chipped and cracked. So I've got all bonds on the teeth to fix them. As a result of that beating by President Mugabe's bodyguards, who left me unconscious, and a beating by neo-Nazis in Moscow in 2007, I got permanent brain damage and eyesight damage in this eye. Before I had exceptionally good eyesight. I could stand at a bus stop and tell long before anybody else the number of a bus. But now I really struggle, like you're all a bit slightly out of focus. But you know, it doesn't stop me, but you know, it has been quite a personal price to pay, but I say nothing by comparison to what happens to human rights defenders in many other countries. You know, think what happens to people in Iran or Saudi Arabia. You know, they get locked up and tortured. You know, that hasn't happened to me.
So would you stand?
Oh, sorry, what was I saying? Probably not. Probably not. You know, I never had a burning ambition to be an MP. The only reason I ended up standing for Labour in this area back in 1983 was because I was a local party secretary and organiser, a voluntary position, and I did a lot of, you know, very effective work rebuilding the local party and reconnecting with the local community. So I was sort of chosen on the basis that they wanted someone local. But that was just really a fluke. You know, I think in many ways probably I've done more on the outside than I could have done as an MP. Because, you know, you think about it, you know, MPs spend so much of their time on constituency work. And it's really important that MPs help local constituents, but that means they're not scrutinising legislation. They're not in the House of Commons debating and proposing. They're not devising policy. They're spending too much time in their constituency helping constituents, which means that there's not proper scrutiny on challenges to legislation.
And a pressure to conform
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, yeah. If you go into Parliament, you know, for a party, you have to take the party whip. You have to follow the party line, even if you believe the party line is wrong. And you know, I'm all in favour of party loyalty, but I also have my conscience. And my conscience may be right or it may be wrong, but I like to follow it.
More money, more problems.
Sorry?
More money, more problems.
More money, more problems.
Yeah.
What do you mean?
With more money comes more problems.
Oh yeah.
Well, thank you very much.
I'd say, if any of you are really interested, please take one of these flyers which are on the table over there. It's about my Human Rights Foundation, the Tatchell Foundation. On the back it tells you how to sign up, so you can, it's free, you can receive weekly campaign e-bulletins about different campaigns, some of which you might want to be involved with, some of you may not. But for example, next week on the 19th, we're organising a protest outside Uganda House to protest at the new anti-gay law in that country, which stipulates automatic life imprisonment for any same-sex act, including mere touching. In Uganda now, if you touch someone with homosexual intent, just a touch, a caress, a stroke, life imprisonment. Advocating gay rights or gay equality, I think it's 10 years in prison. So if you sign up to our email bulletins, you get notice about that protest. And there's also stuff about Facebook and Twitter as well. So take one if you're interested, or if you think you know someone who might be interested, take one for them. Thank you.